This video is about Ashtanga Yoga, which is the eight-limbed yoga of meditation. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna describes Dhyana Yoga, which means the yoga of meditation. Ashtanga Yoga is specifically a form of Dhyana Yoga, which was systematized by a sage named Patanjali in a text called the Yoga Sutra. So the Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita are two extremely important primary sources on classical forms of yoga. This eight-limbed form of yoga, Ashta meaning eight and Anga meaning limbs, is not the same as what is commonly taught as Ashtanga Yoga in modern yoga studios, which is actually Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, which was a system that was created by a teacher named Pattabhi Jois in the 20th century. And I'm not particularly familiar with that system, but from what I understand, it actually has very little to do with the eight limbs at all. So, Ashtanga Yoga, in the classical sense, is an extremely influential system of spiritual practice, which draws heavily on the Sankhya philosophy, which I discussed in the video on yogic philosophies a little bit. Sankhya is a highly dualistic philosophy where the primary dualism is between Purusha as witnessing consciousness and Prakriti as material nature. And the goal of the Sankhya system is to discern awareness from mind and body, basically. To separate out this witnessing consciousness from its mistaken identification with transient materiality. There's a very interesting, helpful system of tattvas or elements that are described in the Sankhya system, which also go on to influence Shakta Shaiva philosophy in a very big way, that describes these tattvas in terms of one tattva being Purusha and then 24 different tattvas being aspects of Prakriti. So there is Mula Prakriti, which means the root or primordial nature. It's roughly analogous to the term prima materia, which means primal matter, basically. Mula Prakriti is unmanifest matter. It's nature before it has expressed itself into diverse forms. Within Mula Prakriti, there are three gunas. Gunas means threads. And these gunas, when they become imbalanced, cause Mula Prakriti to manifest and to express itself into all these different objects of experience. The three gunas are called Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And these are very important in Ayurveda and Yoga and Tantra. Sattva is purity and harmony and clarity. Rajas is passion and stimulation. Tamas is inertia and darkness and slow heaviness. So there are different ways in which these gunas can express themselves through the natural world. And one example of that is in the foods that we eat. We can see how stimulants like coffee or tea or things that are very spicy tend to have a rajasic effect. They tend to be very stimulating or to increase passion or to agitate us. Or things like meat or alcohol are very tamasic. They're very heavy and tend to dull our senses. Whereas things like fresh fruit or fresh vegetables are very sattvic for the most part, depending on which kind of fruit or vegetable. But there are also different ways in which different yogic practices can work with the gunas. And the general emphasis in Ashtanga Yoga is on increasing the levels of sattva within our body and our mind in order to increase harmony and clarity and our ability to discern this witnessing consciousness from its material identifications. And at the same time as we're trying to increase sattva, we try to moderate rajas. We need a little bit of rajas, especially if we have a lot of tamas in our system, because the rajas helps to transform and stimulate the tamas. It can actually help to transform tamas into sattva in some cases, but too much rajas can also be very overstimulating and can cause the senses to turn outwards and to grasp after limited material indulgences that are not going to be healthy or helpful for our spiritual practice in the long run. And tamas, generally speaking, we want to limit as well. We need a certain amount of tamas in order to sleep and to rest, but we don't want to be too heavy or too dull. So the emphasis within yoga is on sattva, generally speaking. Ashtanga yoga, like I said, uses the Sankhya philosophy for the most part, but Patanjali was also a little bit more of a theist than the people who systematized the Sankhya philosophy. And he also includes certain elements that are not found in that philosophy around Ishvara, who is a non-sectarian divinity or God, and also around specific practices in order to facilitate this process of discerning consciousness from matter or from nature. And these specific practices are the 8 limbs, Ashtanga. The first 2 of the 8 limbs are the yamas and the niyamas. So these are ethical restraints and ethical observances. And they are guidelines to moderate the ways that we interact with others and the ways that we interact with ourselves. These guidelines are based on an understanding of causality or cause and effect, basically the principle that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and karma, meaning that there are these subtle impressions created by our actions that bind us and force us to experience the consequences of our actions. So these guidelines are helping to create healthy, positive karmic patterns that will promote and enhance our spiritual practice. These are ideals that cannot always and in every situation be upheld perfectly, but we should strive to uphold these ideals as best we can, especially if we're on a serious spiritual path. The yamas, which are ways that we interact with others, are ahimsa, which means nonviolence, satya, which means truthfulness, asteya, which means non-stealing, brahmacharya, which means ethical sexual behavior, and aparigraha, which means non-possessiveness. And of these 5 yamas, the most important is ahimsa, non-violence. So that means that if we are in a situation where we could tell the truth, practice the principle of satya, truthfulness, but telling the truth would cause harm to somebody, then it would be better to not say what we were going to say. Through practicing these principles, we can cultivate sattva and increase our discernment. And there are different ideas about exactly how these principles should be applied in different situations. And not everybody agrees exactly the same all the time. For example, brahmacharya, the guideline about ethical sexual behavior, is interpreted in many different ways in different contexts, including for renunciates, it means total celibacy in some cases. In other cases where there are householder practitioners of yoga, it can mean being faithful to a partner. And in modern society and in societies where there are forms of non-monogamous relationships which are ethical. It still means that the partners are open and honest with each other and not causing harm to each other or lying to each other or doing anything of that sort. Asteya, which means non-stealing, and aparigraha, which means non-possessiveness, are both different ways of talking about this habit or this way of acting that promotes a feeling of not having enough or not being enough, because people steal things because they feel like they don't have enough, and they grasp onto things because they mistakenly believe that external objects can provide them with some kind of enduring satisfaction, where really the only enduring satisfaction comes from universal consciousness. The niyamas, which is the second limb of yoga, are the ways that we interact with ourselves. The 5 niyamas are shaucha, which means purity, santosha, which means contentment, tapas, which means discipline, svadhyaya, which means self-study, and ishvara pranidhana, which means surrender to Ishvara. Shaucha, or purity, means that we should keep our bodies generally clean for the most part. We don't have to be super obsessive about it or anything, but we should bathe regularly. We should eat healthy foods. We should, brush our teeth, practice hygiene. We should promote pure spiritual kinds of thought as well and speech, so that we are promoting sattva in our lives. Santosha, which is contentment again, is helping us to accept what is, not necessarily to accept injustice or violence or things of that nature, but to feel like we have enough and to not be greedy and to seek after more than we need. Tapas is a word that literally means heat, but often is associated with discipline and ascetic practice. So there are a lot of different forms of spiritual practice or yoga that involve generating heat within the body, and this can tend to have a purifying effect, and it can also relate to the awakening of tejas, or the inner fire, the mental fire, so that we can discern this pure consciousness and perceive it directly.